my people engaged with the Methodists. Other people engaged with Anglicans and Catholics. My people and at least 15 of our coastal communities in British Columbia were first converted to the Methodist Church. And when they came to us, they asked us for the land and asked us to help them build churches. And they would provide the ministry. In some instances, they asked us to help them build schools so that the missionary wives could teach our children in school. And that very quickly changed. Governments became involved in creating first building schools on our reserves, which began to teach us very elementary education. And then they started these institutions called Indian residential schools. And they went into our villages with their Indian agents and the police and other government personnel to tell our parents that we had to be taken as children and sent to these schools. In my own instance, I had come from a family of 8, and I went to a school on Vancouver Island, which was about 300 or 400 miles away from my home territory. My older sister went to a place in the Fraser Valley, which was another 300 or 400 miles away from home. And 2 other sisters went to a place closer to home, but still a couple hundred miles away from home. My younger brother went to another province in Edmonton, which was quite a bit removed from our home. And we each spent years and only went home for summers if we could afford to. Fortunately for all of us, we were able to go home every summer, but that was the time we went home and spend time with our families. But anyway, sticking with the idea of religion and church, our spiritual practices, like I said, were very quickly abolished through missionary activity, government activity. If our people practiced the potlatch culture, they were sent to jail. If we gathered in groups of more than 3 or 4, we were charged with illegal assembly because they suspected we might be talking about land and land claims, things like that. And the church, in my instance, the United Church sent ordained supply to all of our villages. And for years, these people stayed with us, not just 1 or 2 or 3 years, but they spent years and they learned the language and they lived and interacted with us. Today, not so. Many of our villages don't have ordained supply. Many of the people, if they do come for 1, 2, or 3 years and they move on. So in order for our people who have adopted Christianity and the church, as opposed to returning to our native spiritual practices, we are without ordained supply, so we begin to look at lay volunteers initially to help our people move through the exercise of worship. And eventually those people saw that that wasn't quite enough, and we started working with the United Church, and they have established 2 training centers for First Nations ministers. One center in Manitoba called the Dr. Jesse Soto Training Center, and the Francis Sandy Center in Ontario, which is near Toronto. And Vancouver School of Theology operates quite a different training center where we, as British Columbia First Nations, work with the Vancouver School of Theology, the Anglican Church, and the United Church to establish what we call Native Ministries Doctor of Divinity degree program, where we engage our elders in our communities to participate in the training of potential ministers, incorporating those spiritual practices which were earlier condemned. And that took some doing because many of our academic theologians at the school were at first very resistant to the idea. But eventually we won over with the support of 2 or 3 champions on faculty who really believed what we say, you know, what we were doing was going to be okay. So we now have these training programs that do incorporate not just the teaching of the traditional practices, but also incorporating the elders as teachers. And our elders are regarded as equal to doctorates and professors in a school. And I don't want to spend too much time on the idea of residential school, but remember, they beat the language out of us, and they beat the culture out of us in those schools. So it's very difficult for us to fully capture and recapture what it is that we call traditional practice. So we've had to do some research, engage some anthropologists and other people to help us identify what it is that we were doing before all of the things that we used to do were condemned and basically tortured out of us. And we now have what I think is a very early stage of reconciliation, working with the church and the church people to help us, not just grow within their culture and their practice, but also helping us regain and recapture what it is that we have. And Jamie will speak to some of the things that the church has taken on in terms of making us feel more comfortable in a relationship which isn't yet in a long way from being a right relation. But it's something we're moving towards, and as First Nations people, many of us are heavily engaged in that work with that goal and the purpose, and not to isolate ourselves and return to something which wouldn't necessarily be as complete and safe, I think, as we think it might be. So I think we're stuck with each other, so we have to work with each other. And that's the approach we take. So I'm going to let Jamie take it from here.